Good evening, and thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Merwin Chambers. I'm treasurer of the Friends of the Gwinnett County Public Library. The Friends work to promote the library system and assist the library staff at events such as this one, as well as other projects where we're requested. If you're not a current member, I encourage you to join. The author's books are for sale and signing tonight. This program is being filmed, as you can see, and will be available for viewing on the library's YouTube channel in a few weeks. George Weinstein is the author of the beloved Southern historical novel, Hardscrabble Road. Its 2022 sequel, Return to Hardscrabble Road, the novel of forgotten U.S. history, The Five Destinies of Carlos Moreno, the domestic drama, The Caretaker, the amateur sleuth murder mystery, Aftermath, and the kidnapping thriller, Watch What You Say. George is the executive director of the Atlanta Writers Club and has helped thousands of writers on their quest for publication through the club and through the twice-yearly Atlanta Writers Conference, which he has managed for the last 15 years. Please join me in welcoming George to the stage.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming out. And I appreciate that introduction, Merwin. Thank you. So we're here to talk about why we read and write historical fiction. I'll give you a little bit about my background. I had a father who was an amateur historian. And I grew up in Maryland between Baltimore and DC. And my father was obsessed with the Civil War, read every book he could find about it. Every time there was a new one, that was the present to give him, you know, at holiday time. He loved everything about that war and would drag me once a month to a battlefield somewhere in Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia down south. So that was my childhood for quite a number of years, was accompanying my dad to all of these battlefields. And my dad was not just interested in troop movements and the high level, you know, this battalion was doing this and this platoon was doing that. He liked the individual stories. So the whole way to the battlefield, as we tramped across miles and miles and miles of the battlefield, and then all the way back, he would be telling me stories about the individuals who were engaged in the particular battle, you know, that we were going to visit or had just visited, or were currently visiting. And it was a reminder that history is not dates and places and these factoids to memorize. It's all about people. It's all about individual stories. And that really instilled in me you know, a love of history and told me the importance of the story behind the story. So it's not just the Battle of Antietam, it's all of the thousands of lives who were engaged in, you know, 3, 4, 5 days of, you know, just hellacious conflict and really fascinating decisions, horrible mistakes, and incredible bravery and gallantry. So that was my childhood. So is it any wonder that, you know, I developed a love of history and turned to historical fiction when I wanted to read for pleasure, so I could immerse myself in the individual stories of people. So what is historical fiction? So numerous sources say that it's not historical fiction if the period between when the writer is currently writing and the events they're writing about is less than 50 years. So you gotta have at least 50 years. If you were writing historical fiction, you gotta have at least 50 years between your current point in time and the subject matter that you're writing about. Otherwise, it's contemporary fiction. It's not to say it's bad or wrong or anything. It's just it's not historical fiction unless it's got at least a vintage of about 50 years. And it's really important that the era being depicted is a character in the story, that you have to get the sense as you're reading the story that this is not a story that could happen any other time or any other place. It's baked in to everything about that story. So that's really important, that second point, that it can't take place at any other time. You don't have a story unless it's taking place in the period in which it's set, because the period itself, the era, is a character. And then lots of historical fiction authors like to bring in actual historical events and or actual historical characters. So George Saunders can't write Lincoln at the Bardo without Abraham Lincoln. So that's another aspect of historical fiction. But you don't even need that third point. You don't even need actual major historical events that we all know about or ought to know about, or historical figures who were critical. It can just be an era that is being depicted. So this is gonna bake your noodle a little bit. I was doing a lot of thinking about, all right, examples of great historical fiction. And I started naming things, okay, great novel about the Jazz Age, The Great Gatsby. Well, that's a great novel about the Jazz Age, but it was written during the Jazz Age. So that is not historical fiction. We think of it as historical because it's so many years distant from our lives. But it was written by F. Scott Fitzgerald in the 1920s, about the 1920s. Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen about the Regency, well, the Georgian period, as she was living in the Georgian period. The Grapes of Wrath, written by Steinbeck, published in 1939, about the Great Depression, written during the Great Depression. All Quiet on the Western Front, The Sun Also Rises. All of these great examples of literature that we can just name right off the top of our heads, they're not historical fiction because they were written by authors in that time period, or less than one generation removed typically. So why did they write those books? They wrote their books to entertain through literature, to raise awareness, to bring truths about the human condition. When Charles Dickens was writing the Great Expectations, he wanted to raise awareness about working conditions, the lives of orphans. It's just the horrible squalor that so many people in London were living in. So if we're talking about historical fiction, again, it's got to be 50 years or more distant from when that author is writing. However, these are tremendous repositories of information, time capsules, if you will, for those who are writing historical fiction. Why? Because you get the language. So if I'm writing about the 1920s, I want to read novels like The Great Gatsby because it's written in the language of the 1920s. It's written with the point of view of people in the 1920s, the thoughts, the mindsets, all of those things. If I want to capture dialogue and the kind of slang people used, kind of slang they didn't use, all of those books are just priceless because they give you those little time capsules. But they're not historical fiction. Take nothing away from them. They're all classics, but they're not historical fiction. So which eras inspire the most historical fiction? I think they're eras where we have had the greatest conflicts in our history and or the inflection points where culture is changing, where there are profound changes occurring and people are rewiring their brains about how they think about certain things. Or somebody is coming along and forcing people to reckon with a different reality than they had previously, reckoned. So I think those are the two ways we get most of our historical fiction. And I've got a lot of examples. So from the top left, prehistoric. We have prehistoric historical novels. The most famous one is probably Clan of the Cave Bear. Egyptian times, ancient Egypt, Nefertiti, and there are probably a dozen more that were just wonderful books about what it was like to live during ancient Egyptian times. If you like biblical, The Red Tent is a huge bestseller about 10 years ago. Shogun, Feudal Japan. Pillars of the Earth, Ken Follett's classic, and he's written many sequels since. All about the Dark Ages and living in medieval Europe. The Agony and the Ecstasy. Does anybody remember that one? Irving Stone. Yeah, the kind of a biographical novel about the life of Michelangelo and the Renaissance. Who had to read Johnny Tremain in school? All right, I'm glad it wasn't just me. So, American Revolution. This kid ends up apprenticing with Paul Revere and learns silversmithing and gets a front row seat to the start of the revolution. The French Revolution, Tale of Two Cities, classic work by Dickens. War and Peace, Tolstoy, all about the Napoleonic Wars. Roots takes us through the American slavery period. Gods and Generals, just one of 100 great novels about the American Civil War. We were talking about Michener earlier, Merwin and I. So Centennial is a great book he wrote, an absolute brick of a book, a real tome, all about Western expansion. Ragtime, everybody remember Ragtime? E.L. Doctorow. And people don't read him anymore. He was a wonderful historical fiction writer. Wrote all about the American Gilded Age in Ragtime. Books about World War II, again, major conflicts. The Alice Network is just one I pulled off the top of my head, but there are dozens of others. Toni Morrison's Jazz, all about the Harlem Renaissance and the American Jazz Age. Again, written in this time, not Great Gatsby, which F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote during the Jazz Age. Toni Morrison wrote that novel in the 90s. So many books about the American Great Depression. William Kent Kruger, This Tender Land, Sarah Gruen, Water for Elephants, just wonderful books that really put you in the struggles and the real heroism of the Great Depression. And then this is a little cheeky. All the Light We Cannot See, The Nightingale, and about 10,000 other novels about World War II. Is there anybody in a book club in here? How many times have you said to your book club, can we take a break from World War II? Just no World War II for the rest of this year. And yet they keep coming out with more wonderful books set in World War II. Bone-chilling, blood-curdling books. Some of them are, make you weep. Some of them inspire you. So many books have come out of World War II. This is a recent book. Has anybody heard about Lynn Cullen's Woman with the Cure?
She spoke last Thursday.
Yeah. So it's all about polio and the search for the cure. So that's a book set in the 50s, really about the 50s. Colson Whitehead, The Nickel Boys, set in the early 1960s, about the civil rights movement and its impact on these young boys in this terrible place in Florida. Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried, just the classic novel, really a string of connected short stories all about the Vietnam War. And Daisy Jones and the Six, which I understand is a TV show now, really captures the essence of the 70s. And then you hit the 1980s, and that isn't technically historical fiction anymore. It's just early contemporary fiction. Here's some subgenres of historical fiction. Historical fiction is so popular that it spawned all these subgenres. And the top one, of course, is historical romance. There are thousands of books written every year about the Regency period, the Elizabethan period, Georgian, medieval, Renaissance, on and on and on. You can pick any period in history, and Harlequin has an entire imprint devoted to that. And there are readers who just devour these books, one a day, one after the other. It's a huge niche in the market. Westerns. Westerns are so popular, they have their own subgenre. That's a whole subgenre of historical fiction just called Westerns. Lonesome Dove is my favorite one. But Louis L'Amour, Max Brand, they've written hundreds and hundreds of books in that genre. Historical thrillers, so Ken Follett and his contemporaries have written wonderful thrillers. Day of the Jackal, Eye of the Needle, two classics. Historical mysteries. Anybody remember The Name of the Rose with Umberto Eco, who when asked why did he write The Name of the Rose, he said, I felt like poisoning some monks. The Alienist, Caleb Carr, that was a huge bestseller for him a number of years ago, all about developing forensic mindsets and fighting crime using clues with Jack the Ripper running amok. Historical speculative fiction, Outlander, Diana Gabaldon's series. That was the first one, of course. Time travel. Alternative history and a little bit of time travel, Guns of the South. That was Harry Turtledove, about this guy who invented a time machine so he could transport AK-47s to the Civil War and arm Robert E. Lee and the Confederacy with AK-47s. And that has spawned dozens of books since and really helped invent the subgenre of alternative history. And then steampunk, The Anubis Gates by Tim Powers. The Anubis Gates invented the genre of steampunk, where there's a combination of Victorian setting and a little bit of sci-fi, a little bit of technology that they didn't really have, but what if they did, and what would happen? So what captivates us as readers of historical fiction? Why do we keep buying novels set in other time periods and reading about people who are not our contemporaries, but people who are long gone? So I think they break down among many different groups. I think the first group is some of us are just fascinated by a certain time period and we read everything we can about it. There's something about it, either because of a personal connection to it or some sort of emotional or intellectual connection where we cannot get enough of the 1920s, 1930s, you know, the Jazz Age and the Great Depression, or the Regency period, or what have you, World War II. That there is something about the styles, the music, the culture, the people who struggled through those time periods. There's just something about, you know, reading about the greatest generation, you know, fighting World War II over and over again through countless books. I think some of us get this vicarious thrill about seeing people who remind us of a great-great-grandmother or grandfather or another relative overcoming long, long odds and seeing them in historical works, you know, so reading about immigrants who had to overcome long odds when they came to America, because we remember stories from our grandmothers, great-grandmothers, fathers, his side of the family, about their relatives and what they had to overcome in order to provide for their families, actually start a family. So I think some of us read those kind of books because they remind us of those family stories. The flip side is we don't know anything about those time periods and we're curious. So I think that's another whole group of people who are reading historical fiction is, I don't know anything about ancient Egypt. I've seen King Tut when I was 10, and I've seen Brendan Fraser's The Mummy, and okay, that's enough for me. I want to know about ancient Egypt. And they just plunge in and they read everything they can about ancient Egypt because they don't know anything about it, but it's interesting to them from an intellectual standpoint, and they want to learn more. And they get hooked. So that's another whole group of people who are really reading to get introduced to a topic and understand. So I think these last two are flip sides of one another. They're the opposite sides of the coin. So I think there's some people who like to read historical fiction because they see themselves, our current culture, our problems, and they want to understand how we got here. And so they go back and read historical fiction to get some insights about how we got to this point in time with our current problems and our current culture and why people are the way they are. On the flip side, I think there are people who want to escape from our current problems and current culture, et cetera. And so they want to immerse themselves in all the trials and tribulations of people who've come before. So historical fiction as escapism, I think that's really powerful. And then here's some other possibilities. And this is me to some degree. One of the reasons I write historical fiction among my other genres, but also why I like to read it, is because many of us are very comfortable in our current circumstances, but we want an adventure where the struggles are real, things are life and death, and the outcomes are really uncertain, and you can't solve your problems by texting a friend or Googling something. Think of all the great works of literature that would not exist because if on page 1, David Copperfield could have texted a friend, or, well, he was just born on page 1, so give him till page 30. Or somebody Googles something. You see this today in modern dramas, right? Their cell phone is suddenly without coverage, or they've lost their cell phone and the cell phone dies, because with that cell phone, all their problems are solved. So the writers almost have to transport these people into another historical era by making sure they don't have access to this modern technology that solves so many problems. So I like to read books where people can't solve their problems quite so easily. And there are some people who love to read about people who are at the very top of the food chain, the royals, those who are the ultimate haves. And then there are others who like to read about the ultimate have-nots, because those are the underdogs. Those are people who are scraping by every day, and oh my God, how are they going to get out of this horrible situation when they have no resources? They just have their wits. That's very appealing to many of us. But there are people who love to read about royals and people who have everything under the sun to see what obnoxious things they get up to. So why do we continue to write historical fiction? Well, first of all of the above, everything we just covered, is the reason that I write historical fiction and most other historical fiction authors do. There's a family connection, there's a personal connection, there's an intellectual or emotional connection to something in the past or some era. But when I look at history, I just see this infinite number of stories that can be told from all these different points of view. And every period of time is fascinating. They've all got their own challenges. They've all got their own mysteries, all got their own cultures. All of that is fascinating. So I can't get enough of historical fiction for that reason. And then we'll talk about my books a little bit. So I've written 3 novels of historical fiction. So that first point, personal connections to tales of some underdogs. So when I was married for the first time in the 1990s, my former father-in-law was the greatest storyteller God's ever put on this earth. It was a very natural thing he did. And whatever we were talking about at the supper table or the dinner table, it was a proper Southern household, so there was no lunch. There was dinner at noon and then supper in the evening. Whatever we were talking about, he would push back from the table when we were clearing plates and relate whatever we were chatting about to growing up in the 1930s as the son of sharecroppers, the poorest of the poor in the South, and scraping out a living from the land, and living at a time with people who were the ultimate have-nots. And if you didn't grow it, trap it, fish it, hunt it, catch it, or steal it, you did not eat. Day after day after day, you did not know how much you were going to eat, what you were going to be able to eat. You were living by the skin of your teeth. And so this is him. This photo was taken in 1937. It's the only picture that exists of him and his two older brothers. And it looks like it's something out of Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn. It's just an iconic picture. Cannot believe there was one uncle who had a little bit of money, who had a camera and captured that picture. But that's my former father-in-law, Roger in the book Hardscrabble Road, and his middle brother Chet in the book, and then his oldest brother Jay. And then the three boys again in the sequel, Roger, Chet, Jay. It's the only picture that exists of them as teenagers. And I spent a decade collecting his stories because his childhood could not have been any different than mine. I grew up privileged, middle class, boring, suburban childhood where, my dad worked, my mom was a homemaker, my brother and sister and I, whatever we wanted to eat, you want Fruit Loops today, there's Fruit Loops in the pantry. You want Cocoa Puffs tomorrow, there's Cocoa Puffs in the pantry. And he is, talking about splitting a couple of wormy tomatoes and a handful of butter beans and maybe half a boiled possum among 6 people, and everybody going to bed hungry and waking up even hungrier. So his stories were fascinating to me because I could not imagine that kind of childhood. I cannot imagine surviving it. And so I would run back to the bedroom when he would after he would tell these stories, and I would write down these tales, and I collected them for an entire decade, all the while thinking, boy, there's something here, until I decided there's a book here. And so I approached him, and I said, I am going to write historical fiction. I'm going to change everybody's name, I'm going to change events, but I would really like your childhood stories to kind of inspire a lot of what happens in this book. Would you partner with me on this? Because I've got a lot more questions. And he said, who would care? So I was just one of a million poor Southern kids who, had a terrible childhood during the Great Depression and escaped into the military. It's what we did. Then my story is nothing special. And I said, well, I didn't know you from Adam in 1991, and you made me care. So I think we can make other people care. And he really resisted. So I thought back to some of the stories he told me. So his father was an absolute psychopath. He beat his children, his boys, mercilessly. They had an older sister. He had no idea what to do with the older sister. He left her alone and just treated her with kid gloves like a little princess. But the boys just lived under his thumb their entire childhoods. And to make extra money, he was a bootlegger. He was a wholesale bootlegger. He did not make the moonshine. He did not sell the moonshine in the classic mason jars, the little quart jars. He was the go-between. So he had contacts in Florida who were moonshiners, and he would go down there once a month on the moonless night, the one moonless night of each month, and buy 50-pound barrels of bootleg whiskey, come back. In the cover of darkness, he would sell these casks of whiskey to the retailers, who would then dispense it into the mason jars and sell them out behind the police station or out behind their barn or wherever. And he would always bring one of his boys with him as a human shield, because there were revenue agents who were constantly hunting him And he knew that a revenuer would not shoot into his truck if he had one of his children sitting up there. And so my father-in-law and his two older brothers spent their childhoods as human shields to protect Papa from the revenuers. Can you imagine growing up this way? Can you imagine not writing about this when you hear it? Because, oh my God, this is fascinating. It's horrible, but it's fascinating. And so Papa had to dispense bribes left and right to keep his business going, when there's the law around. So there was the high sheriff in the county in Florida where the bootleggers lived. He was on the payroll. And my father-in-law was named after that high sheriff as a bribe to him. So there was no sentimental reason for it. In real life, his name was Vernon. Everybody called him Bud, and I used Bud in the book, but his real name was Vernon. And he hated his name. And he hated his name because there was no sentimentality attached to that name. It wasn't a name that got passed down from one generation to the next. It was a bribe to this fat old sheriff in this Florida county, as just another way to appease that man. So I said, look, you've never liked your name. Why don't you name the main character? Any name you want, and that's what we'll call him. He says, well, I always like the name Roger. I said, that's it. His name's going to be Roger. He said, just like that? I said, yeah, he's going to be Roger. People will call him Bud, but his name will be Roger. And it was like flipping a light switch in his head. Suddenly he had ownership because he has named the main character in this book. And then I got very intentional about interviewing him about the way things smelled and tasted and felt and sounded. Take me from a hog killing, from the beginning to the end, when everybody's sitting around eating eggs and brains. I know, but that was a delicacy to them. Whenever I would make that face that some of you just made, and I made that face to him, he said, clearly you didn't grow up hungry. And that was a constant reminder of how privileged I was, that I had Fruit Loops in the pantry. He didn't have a pantry, let alone Fruit Loops. And brains and eggs was a delicacy. And he was glad to get it. He was grateful. He was like that about the military too. And then if anybody ever ran down Army chow, he said, anybody who runs down Army food has never been hungry. He said they fed us 3 solid meals a day. I grew big and strong. It was great. So I interviewed him very intentionally, and then it took me about 2 years to write the book, Hardscrabble Road. I got a literary agent, and the agent tried to sell it and gave me some great advice, which was always be working on another book. Went to work on other books. Hardscrabble Road never sold when I had this literary agent. My father-in-law was right. Nobody did care. Remember he said, who would care? Nobody did care. I could not make anybody care about this story that just tugged at my heart for a solid decade. And so I ended up firing the literary agent and doing some other things, doing some other writing adventures. Finally, in 2012, I'd been involved in the Writers Club, Atlanta Writers Club, for over a decade, and I was at a friend's book signing. It was his book launch, and it was just me, the bookseller, and his publisher, my friend's book publisher, showed up for his launch, and I got to chatting with him, and he said, well, George, have you written anything? Well, my father-in-law had just passed away. He never saw the book in print, never inquired about it, because the fact that it didn't get published proved that he was right when he told me who would care. Nobody cared. But he was really on my mind, and I had a bunch of manuscripts by that time, but what was I thinking about? Thinking about him and his remarkable, horrible childhood that inspired so many great stories and inspired me to write a whole novel, historical novel. And so I told the publisher, the story about this kid, growing up with a psychopath for a father and a mother who had no interest in raising her children. She was too busy sleeping with every other man in Miller County and, scraping out a living in Southwest Georgia during the 30s and 40s. And he said, "Oh, it sounds good. Can you send me the manuscript?" And 4 days later, I had a publishing contract. So that's how that book finally got into print. And then the next book they brought out was the book in red you see here at the bottom. Because the other thing, besides personal stories I've always been fascinated with, thanks to my dad, I've always been interested in what I call forgotten U.S. history. This is history they don't teach in the history books. They don't teach in history classes, often are left out of the history books, and often feature tales of underdogs overcoming long odds. So everybody has heard about the Nisei camps, the Japanese POW camps in World War II, right? I'll bet you haven't heard about the Great Repatriation of 1928 to 1941, where the government deported over 2 million people of Mexican heritage, and half of them were actually American citizens. Has anybody heard about that? Yeah, so a couple of you. The rest of you, this is news, right? And it's news because they don't teach it in history classes. There's never been a movie about it, never been a TV show about it. I ran across it as a footnote on the history of Texas that I was reading as I was sitting in the stacks in the Roswell Library one day, and I thought, I didn't know that. Went back to the bibliography, started looking up all the books that were referenced connected to the Great Repatriation, ordered them all, read them all, and I thought, there's a historical novel here. There needs to be one. And somebody who endured that hopefully has written it. I can't find it, so I'm going to write it. And so I wrote a novel called The Five Destinies of Carlos Moreno, all about somebody trying to avoid that fate of 1 million American citizens. So what would happen is that if you lived in Chicago, Texas, through the Southwest and into California, and you were brown and you looked poor, the law would stop you on the streets, local lawmen as well as the immigration agents. They could stop you on the street and say, "Prove you're a citizen. This minute, prove it." You'd have to have a birth certificate in your pocket to do it. And you wouldn't have a birth certificate in your pocket, because why would you, right? They would say, "Come with us." They'd load you in the back of a truck. And this could be men going to their factory jobs, women going to market, children coming from school. They'll load you in the back of a truck with a whole bunch of other people they've collected, drive you to the border, Brownsville, places like that. And they have this kangaroo court. They find you guilty of being in the country illegally, and they put you on what they called a repatriation train and send you, along with thousands of others, to the south end of Mexico, places like Oaxaca, and kick you out, and now you're 3,000 miles from the border. This happened from 1928 to 1941. So it was not a political thing. It started with the Hoover administration, the Republicans, but then FDR did it throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, and would have kept doing it, except what happened in 1941? World War II. Suddenly we got to go fight World War II, and men by the thousands are drafted or enlist to go fight World War II, and now who's laying railroad tracks, and who's working in factories, and who's working on farms? Oh, let's go back to Mexico and invite these people to come back. And the real irony is that when draft notices went out after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and all the draft boards started up, draft notices started going out. Our post office used to be so good that they were able to get draft notices down to the south end of Mexico, where they had kicked out these people for over a decade, and draft them to come fight for the country that kicked them out. But at least here finally was the proof that they were American citizens, because they have been drafted to go fight World War II. And there were train tickets, and they hopped on a train. They couldn't take their families with them. They go up to the border and say, you got to let me in. I've been drafted to go fight a war for you, you people who kicked me out. And they fought World War II and then spent the next decade trying to get their families back out of Mexico. They at least finally had the proof that they were American citizens all along, which nobody believed. That's great stuff, but why has there not been 10 historical novels written about this, right? It's not been a one that I could find. So that's why I wrote The Five Destinies of Carlos Moreno. I love tales of underdogs. I love tales of people overcoming long, long odds. So my publisher published that one next. I've since written mysteries, thrillers, domestic dramas, all kinds of stuff. Hardscrabble Road continues to outsell all my other books combined. And so last year I brought out Return to Hardscrabble Road, which fits in some of the adventures that I couldn't fit in the first book that were inspired from real events, and then other things from my own warped imagination. So this is a question I like to ponder is, all right, let's jump in the time machine and go forward. There's a historical novelist in 2070 who's thinking about writing the great 2020 historical novel. What are they going to put in there? Well, there's some real obvious stuff. There's COVID. There's political and cultural divisions. There's gender identity issues. And people kind of coming into their own who've been in the shadows way too long. Contemporary wars. So, fast forward another year and you got Russia invading Ukraine. Somebody in 2070 something is going to write a historical novel about the current war that we see in the news every day. The rise of new technologies. There's all this artificial intelligence now. There's the way the internet has changed everything, cell phones, all of that. And the new versions of those that are changing things even more. But what else? What do you think they're going to write about?
Elon Musk and all his stuff.
Yeah, there may be the great Elon Musk novel of the 2070s. Yeah, what else?
The U.S. government released the videotapes showing non-terrestrial craft flying around U.S. Navy carriers and then driving to the bottom of the ocean and said, we don't know where they come from.
Yeah, right, right.
Not a conspiracy theorist or anything, but they show them coming from outside the atmosphere and then diving to the bottom of the ocean, then leaving again at speeds that we can't imagine. And they've denied this for years. In the middle of the COVID pandemic and everything else, they came out and just released a memorandum and said, oh, yeah, this happens on a regular basis.
Yeah, and we can't explain
We
it.
can't really explain it or do anything about it. So
Right, right. But we're studying it. Yeah, yeah, right. So that's going to be historical speculative fiction.
Yeah.
What else? What else comes to mind? What do you think people are going to be writing about in 50 years?
Emergence of AI.
Yep. So rise of new technologies. Yep, that's going to change everything. It's going to put a lot of us out of work and create a whole new batch of jobs. I'm afraid not an equivalency, unfortunately. What else? Anything else? I like to think about this stuff because
For me, it's you've got they finally proved that inside the Great Pyramids in Giza, they found extra shafts with extra rooms that had been theorized about, but now they have the technology to actually prove that they exist.
That's right. Yep. And now it's time to explore them.
We find things in archaeology all the time: scrolls, footprints, dinosaurs that we didn't know existed.
That's right. Right.
All that stuff.
Yep. All grist for the historical novelist mill. All right. It's Q&A time. You got questions, I got answers. Or at least I got opinions. What do you want to know?
So many of these historical fiction works seem to be kind of downers, like The Four Winds and This Tender Land.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they've got some lighter moments in it, but overall, when I finish, I feel kind of depressed.
Yeah, it's because life was hard. Life is a lot harder any other time in history than right now. And it's hard right now for a lot of people that folks aren't writing about yet. I hope they will. But as hard as it is for some folks right now, imagine how many more people had to endure so much more at every other point in history. I mean, we are so lucky to be living when we are and where we are. You know, and I think the reason people write historical novels is to open our eyes about how hard life has been, you know, for so many, for so long. And I get that a lot with Hardscrabble Road, that there ought to be a warning on it that this is, you know, the first 100 pages are rough. They're like getting kicked in the gut again and again and again because of how hard, you know, a life these people had. It would have been hard enough just to grow up in grinding poverty, but to then grow up in grinding poverty with a sociopath a psychopath for a father, and a mother who, you know, so what they would talk about their papa like a tornado who moved through their lives, their childhoods, every day, you know, this terrible twister, cutting a path of destruction through their childhoods. But about their mother, they would say that she woke up every morning and thought as often as not, let's see what happens when I push my kids into the path of this tornado versus pulling them to safety, which he had the ability to do and then chose not to. Can you imagine growing up with two such people? So the first 100 pages of this are really, really hard. And then things get a little better as the kids get a little older and have a little agency and can fight for themselves. But I think that speaks to just how difficult and almost impossible life has been for so many eons for so many of us. And it's just a wonder anybody survives to procreate, you know, so there can be another generation. You know, I marvel at the fortitude of people. And I think that's why I love stories about underdogs, because they somehow overcome. And they overcome enough to have a family and raise children and send those kids into a world that you hope is a little bit better. But for thousands of years was not. It was the same life over and over and over again, because there was no technology making things better. There were no cultures making things better, no societies making things better. It was just the same damn thing from generation to generation. But oh my God, they got through it. You know, some did, each generation, and survived long enough to produce some more kids and hope they had a better life.
But that still exists today.
Absolutely.
I work for the school systems and all, and it's just, that is still out there. People don't realize how many kids are still in that type of situation today that
Absolutely.
they are trying to get back out of. And
Yep.
luckily there are people there to support them, but there are still kids you can't get to.
Yeah, yeah, and I hope that those novelists in the 2070s are writing about those kids and what they had to go through and how they overcame or failed to overcome, you know, if we're going to have a downer book. And, you know, just open people's eyes to struggles. Yeah, you had a question.
Ask you about your research. Did you also,
Yeah.
yeah, like did you, you know, go through records of genealogy or anything like that too to find out how they got to where they were?
So, you know, primary sources, I was really lucky doing the Hardscrabble books because I had primary sources. I you know, didn't just interview my former father-in-law, but I had access to his two older brothers and older sister when they were all alive. And they're all gone now. But thank God I was able to talk to them. And then reaching out, I got to meet other people who they talked about. Like, you know, when I would go with them to visit South Georgia and see where all these things happened, you know, oh my God, I haven't seen this person in 40 years. And they, you know, they sharecropped in the property near ours. And I was able to talk to them and just get these little details, you know, just these little things, these nuggets that create credibility, you know, because you put it in a story and that's real, that, you know, that is gold. So, you know, that I was really lucky with that. With the Five Destinies book, there was nobody I could talk to, but there were YouTube videos of people who survived the Great Repatriation and now we're in their 70s, 80s, 90s talking about it and what they had to go through. And then, you know, some historical books have been written about it, but there have only been like 3 or 4 historical books written about it. So there wasn't a lot. I had to do a lot of digging. Yeah. Did you have
That was going to be my question
Yeah.
about the 5 Destinies.
Yeah.
Because I would think that would be a whole lot harder.
Oh, it was.
Since the way you found out about it was a
It
footnote.
was. Right. Yeah, that was a tremendous amount of research. I could still be doing research on that book and not have written it. And that is honestly the hardest thing for a historical novelist, is to stop doing research and start writing the book. So, you know, so my new historical novel, more forgotten U.S. history. Spain owned Florida until 1820, except for a brief period in the 1700s when Britain owned it. But then the American Revolution happened, and then Spain got it back. They basically sold it back to Spain to help fund their war effort. So 1821, Spanish government formally turns over Florida to America. Prior to that, Spain owned it. Lots of people forget that. During the 1700s and the 1800s, slaves who were in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama did not go north. If you were in the southern parts of those southern states, you went south to Florida, and if you swore loyalty to the Spanish king and converted to Catholicism, they'd give you a job. They would free you and give you a job. So if you were sailing past Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, and it's 1810, if you're sailing past that gigantic fort, has everybody's seen that fort, seen pictures of it? You're sailing past that gigantic tabby fort. On the parapets, you would see Spanish soldiers, but you would also see black soldiers in the Spanish helmets with the halberds, you know, all the classic Spanish armor on and all of that. Those were freed slaves. They had a job. That's, you know, and they had a life in San Marcos. And they had a chance, they had an opportunity. Then Spain sells Florida to the US, it immediately becomes a slaveholding state, and oh my God, where are these people gonna go? Well, most of them went to Cuba and Andros and Caribbean nations to escape, you know, what was gonna come, which is, you know, a whole bunch of whites who want to re-enslave them. So how many knew about all of that? It's great stuff for historical fiction. So I'm working on that. There are pirates still, you know, sailing around the Caribbean and around the Gulf of Mexico. So it's an incredibly fertile era for fiction, for historical fiction. So that's my new thing. But you want to talk about research? I can be, you know, every sentence requires research, you know, from what they wore to what they ate and how they talked and what they talked about, on and on and on. So that's my new project. God help me, it's going to take me years. But it's so interesting to me. That's what keeps me going. I'm learning every day. And hopefully, you know, I can tell a good story while doing a little education. The foremost thing, if you're interested in writing historical fiction, is you still got to tell an interesting story. If you are just regurgitating facts that you have discovered, you are not going to entertain people. They can get that from Wikipedia or... So, other questions?
Is it, do you feel, when you're writing, do you feel like it's easier or harder if you incorporate a historical character that people know about? Like, I'm thinking about Discovery of Witches, where when they travel back in time, they mention Christopher Marlowe and William Shakespeare.
Yeah. You set the bar so much higher because, you know, well, like Lincoln at the Bardo. So George Saunders had this book that came out a few years ago and kind of set the world on fire for a short time. Abraham Lincoln, how many books have been written about Abraham Lincoln? How many shows have there been? And he is going to have Lincoln as his central character. Every thought and all that, everything that man does and thinks is going to be challenged you know, unless he gets it exactly right. And there's no way he can satisfy everybody, because there will be some people out there, oh no, Lincoln wouldn't say that. You know, Lincoln wouldn't do that. Lincoln wouldn't think that. There are people out there who will do it. So infinitely harder when you choose real historical characters for your historical novels, which is, you know, why, you know, if I've got real historical characters, they're, you know, my former father-in-law and his two older brothers and, you know, psychopathic father and horrible mother. They're real people, but history does not remember them. So there's nobody who can challenge me on them. Yes.
I have a weird question. You're talking about.
I have a weird answer.
Please bring it on. In 2070, like you were saying, and talking about AI, will there be human writers?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Because, or will it be, is it going to pull, the AI writers, is it just going to pull data information from the news, and how's it going to know if it was fake news or really?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
for
they-
historical purposes?
Yep, there will be a best-selling book within the next 5 years that HarperCollins or Simon Schuster, Penguin or Random House will leak was actually written by an AI. This is going to happen. We know it's going to happen. But there will always, we're a storytelling race. We're a storytelling creature, you know. Homo sapiens tell stories. It's what we do. And there will always be writers, and they will always be telling stories. And will the stories be as good as some of the things that AI can write? No, probably not. Because some of that stuff is really convincing. But it'll be different. And as long as you have an imagination and a gift with words, you will be able to write and sell books. So that I want to reassure you that all of our literature is not going to be written by AIs in 70 years or 170 years or 1,070 years. There will still be people writing stories, and there'll still be readers hopefully enjoying those stories, unless it's a bunch of computers reading to each other. I can't imagine that.
I wonder if people will still learn to write at that point, though. That would be my question.
I think so, because it starts with reading. So when I was 6 years old, I wrote plays for my stuffed animals to act out on top of my bed to entertain my brother and sister. Nobody told me to do this. My mom and dad did not say, why, George, you should try writing stories. It was just that as soon as I learned to read, I wanted to write. It's just how my brain is wired. And there will be plenty of others like me who just want to write. And it's what we do. And you can't stop us. And
I think that the future novelists, they'll be the diamonds, while the AI will be cubic zirconias, you know?
yes, there you go. There you go. And some people will be perfectly happy with their cubic zirconiums, and there will be other people who cherish the diamonds and seek out the diamonds. So everything that has happened with technology since the 1990s, since there's been word processing software, has made things easier for writers and harder for writers. So it's much easier to write a book now. That's why there are so many more authors and so many more books being published every year. It's because it's so easy to write a book now. You don't have to type on Carbon. So everything, you know, is easier from that standpoint, but it's also harder because suddenly there's so much more competition than there used to be. And because everybody can write, and now everybody can self-publish if they want to. They don't have to go through the traditional publishers or pay thousands of dollars to some, you know, scammy self-publisher, what they call a vanity press, they've always been out there, but they used to charge an arm and a leg. Now you can do it for free on Kindle. That's good, because you can do it for free and get your work out there, but it's bad because over 2 million books were self-published last year alone. So from my standpoint as an author, that's 2 million more books I'm competing against every year that, you know, maybe I wouldn't have been in a previous era. So everything's easier and everything's harder. AI is just yet another, you know, version of that. But we'll still write, we'll still publish, people will still read. So, anything else? Well, thank you very much. Oh, go ahead.
With writing any kind of historical fiction, and you're basing it obviously in some sort of truth, where do you draw the line between the two? Where you're saying, okay, you know, you're going to write a book about World War II,
Yeah.
or
So you got to get all your facts right. You know, you can't have British troops driving around on BMW motorcycles, right? Because that was a German motorcycle. And Bavarian Motor Works really didn't exist as, you know, a motorcycle maker until after the war. So you got to get all your facts right, because there will be people out there who are aficionados and they'll nail you on it if you don't get them right. In fact, go on Amazon with any historical novel and there will be the snipers who are telling you what an author has gotten wrong. And sometimes they're really embarrassing screw-ups, and sometimes they're so subtle it's just splitting hairs. Beyond the facts, though, I mean, you can have people do whatever they want to do as long as you're not having Lincoln, you know, punch out Robert E. Lee, you know, unless you're writing alternate history and you make that clear that this is speculative fiction, this is alternate history, and Lincoln has mean right and takes out Robert E. Lee with it. Maybe that happens. So, you know, if you are writing straight historical fiction and you're not in one of those fun subgenres, you've just got to get your facts right, and then anything goes. Then you've got free reign. But people have to talk the way that they would talk. People have to act within bounds the way they would act. There can be some free thinkers who maybe think outside of the same box everybody else is in. But, yeah, you know, you can't have somebody in 1860 who feels like they have been transported from 2020, you know, with their attitudes and all of that. You know, you couldn't have, you know, somebody who's hyper liberal and you know, had really advanced ideas about gender identity living in 1860. Just wouldn't happen. Just would not happen. You could have somebody struggling with gender identity issues in 1860, but you wouldn't have, you know, somebody who, you know, is what we would consider today a, you know, a very progressive thinker on the subject. That would probably stretch the bounds, just because the culture was what it was back then, and the people who were who they were, you know, just ingrained. So that's where you have to be careful. But beyond those, you know, those kind of parameters, anything can happen. But you got to get your facts straight, because oh my God, there are people out there just sharpening their knives all the time, just waiting to stab you with a 1-star Amazon review.
So you spoke about the language before, and
Yeah.
you know, if you're going to set a novel in Shakespearean times, they spoke entirely differently.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Unless you're going to write that way, which you're going to have a very small audience
Yeah.
for, you know, remaining true to that, because they're, you know,
yeah.
the sayings that they have, the insults that they have, the
Everything's different.
It's completely different.
Yep, exactly. You can really write this novel in iambic pentameter. No, you're not. But the rhythm of speech can reflect that iambic pentameter. And in fact, we speak that way today. Those rhythms of Shakespeare appear in our everyday sentences, the way we tell jokes, the beats and all of that. Those are all reflected, you know, in, you know, the Elizabethan, you know, forms of speech and the way they talked. So that's, you know, if you see a movie like Shakespeare in Love, where, you know, it's Shakespeare and, you know, a bunch of his kinsmen running around, people speak not exactly the way they would have spoke back then, but enough so that you're willing to suspend disbelief. And that's what you need, is for the audience to suspend disbelief and say, well, they probably wouldn't speak in contractions, but do I really want to read an entire book without contractions, or, you know, without these bizarre, what would for me would be bizarre forms of speech and, you know, sentence constructions and all. Do I really want to endure that? No, I don't. You know, I want something I can understand. So, you know, you tread that line. It's tough. It's really tough. And I'm struggling with that with my book set in the early 1800s because, you know, people don't talk like they did in Hardscrabble Road. You know, I got the Hardscrabble Road speech down, but, you know, take it back another 100 years, 100 plus years, well, you know, it's harder. It's a lot harder, which is why it's taking me a lot longer. Yeah, because, you know, that's one of the way people talk affects the way people think, the way people express themselves, obviously, but it even affects the way people think, you know, their mindsets, all driven by language. So, you know, to get into the head of somebody in 1810, pray for me. It's not easy to do, and the way you do it is you read books written in 1810. You know, you read lots of other historical novels where the authors do it well, and you know, you hope that you can do as well. Yeah. Thank you so much.
And so, thank George, that was fascinating. Although, you know, every time I listen to an author like you who obviously loves their craft, I don't know whether to love you or curse you because my to-be-read list just keeps getting longer, and I think I'll be about 360 years old when I finish what I've got now, and you've added a lot more tonight.
Well, and worse, all those books in the meantime.
In the meantime. And I'd also like to thank the library staff for setting this up and sponsoring these programs. If you haven't picked up a list of the upcoming programs, they're available at the back. And thank you all for coming out tonight. You will sign autographed books for people or sell them to you. I would like to remind you, future events are also listed on the library's website. I'd also like to ask you to consider joining the Atlanta Reads online book club that's sponsored by the Gwinnett County Public Library. Next Tuesday, we'll be discussing The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. And in April, the book selection is This Tender Land by William Kent Kruger.
More depressing books.
But very well written. It's the third Tuesday of every month, and you can register. You do need to register at the library's website. Thank you again for coming out tonight, and thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thank you.